Good Sunday morning and welcome to another edition of At Issue. I'm Corey Smith.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Last week was so consequential that we can't unpack everything in just one program. So we're going to spend the next few weeks looking at the state and national ramifications of the results.
Which thankfully did not take weeks. We're going to start today with the presidential race, which obviously to the surprise of most people was wrapped up before dawn Wednesday morning. Donald Trump, who refused to accept defeat in the last election, sparked a violent riot at the Capitol and was convicted of 34 felony charges and survived 2 assassination attempts, won a second term to the White House.
Democrats were stunned by the results, but many in Congress served as their resistance to Trump in his first term and are gearing up to do so again.
Joining us to talk about the election and the aftermath and so much more is Congressman Jake Auchincloss. He's a Democrat and won re-election to represent Massachusetts' 4th District. And many communities in that district voted for Donald Trump over Vice President Harris. So we want to start there. Why do you think that was? What are you hearing in these, sort of days after this election?
Thanks for having me on. Not just many communities in the Massachusetts 4th, the biggest city in my district, Fall River, for the first time in its modern history, voted for a Republican. In 2004, Fall River had voted for John Kerry, for example, by about 75-25. This year, it was 52-48 for Trump over Harris. And as with any election, it's multifactorial, but number one issue is cost of living, housing, utilities, health care. For 2 years, Americans suffered from demoralizing inflation, and they responded viciously at the ballot box.
Did Democrats maybe go too far and lean too far into the democracy aspect and not necessarily the dollars and cents of everyday pocketbook issues?
When I look at my fellow House Democrats, and we're obviously still in the running to take back the House majority, they were talking about cost of living issues. They were talking about kitchen table issues. The challenge is that Joe Biden was in the Oval Office when Americans experienced, for the first time in their adult lives, it's really been since the 1970s that we've had inflation, the incumbent gets tagged with it. And that's not true just in the United States. That's been true in every single developed economy throughout the entire world. The party that was in government for those 2 years after COVID, when everybody experienced inflation, every single party of governance lost vote share. And that structural headwind was just gale force.
I'm a big fan of saying, your feelings aren't facts. And then, of course, when we talk about the economy in the United States and how healthy it is and how it's rebounded better than any of our cousins across the Western Hemisphere from COVID, and inflation is leveling off and the job situation is great, and people say, but my eggs are costing money. Yes. How do you make an argument to people around facts while acknowledging their feelings? What else could the Democrats and the Harris campaign have done?
Sue, you're right. Real wages have gone up from 2019 to 2024. Productivity growth has gone up. Unemployment is down. Small business starts have improved. So the U.S. economy is the envy of the world. But inflation is a very destabilizing psychological phenomenon. And the number one thing Democrats cannot do, any politician cannot do, is patronize or condescend to voters, to act as though your day in, day out experience of your dollars not going as far is not valid because of A, B, and C. And we have to recognize reality. And then number two is you have to have a audacious agenda for how we're going to get through it. And if you look at housing, health care, and energy bills, what that requires is we've got to build in this country. We've got to build 10 million units of housing. We've got to build 1,000 nuclear power plants. We've got to do more to productize and automate elements of health care that are driving inflation so that we are not eating up 50, 60, 70% of people's wallet with those three sectors.
You have the folks sort of in the aftermath of this saying, well, the progressives, the left, liberals, whomever, are sort of in these different factions, and that's why Kamala lost. She went too far to the center instead of reaching out to the left. Where is the Democratic Party today, and how can all those different factions within the party coalesce to, hopefully, not hopefully necessarily, I won't say hopefully, but to get done what they want to get done?
Right. This is a country of 330 million people, and we have two parties. So both parties are always going to be coalitions, right? I think the distinction that matters is the strong perception of Democrats is that they're not for me. They're for the other person. They're for they're a coalition of different constituencies that one by one they are trying to address, as opposed to being for me. And Donald Trump has achieved that authentic connection with his base, where they think that he is fighting for them. Now, I disagree with that perception. I think that he's fighting for himself and his family above all else. But if we're going to win in 26 and in 28, we have to flip that script in the way that FDR was able to do, and JFK was able to do, and Barack Obama was able to do, where the average American feels like Democrats are for us.
He was obviously able to do that through the use of X, through podcasts, going on with Joe Rogan, sort of reaching that voter who gravitates toward those folks. You also hear a lot of folks saying the left needs that. The left needs its own X and its own Charlie Kirk and Joe Rogan. Is that the solution to fight that sort of information hose with your own?
So I'm not sure my critique of the left would be that they're not online enough. What I would say is this, and you two are more acutely aware of this than I am, the old traditional model of media has been broken. No longer can you do a press conference, no longer can you do a cable news hit and say, I've hit my voters and I've communicated. We are in a balkanized media landscape. You have to go everywhere, you have to be fearless, you have to be effective, you have to shatter echo chambers to communicate with voters. I got my start in politics by knocking 14,000 doors. It was one conversation at a time. And at the national level, I think the mentality is the exact same. One podcast at a time, one Twitch chat at a time, one town hall at a time. There is no shortcut, and it is communicating, and it's also about communicating policy. People will say voters don't care about policy, they don't want to hear it. I profoundly disagree with that. I think there is a huge appetite amongst voters of all stripes and walks of life to dig into the policy details.
All right, let's look ahead to 2025. Are there any areas that you think that you'll be able to work with the Trump administration, with the Republicans, tax cuts maybe, or, you know, we obviously had the issue with the prescription drug prices that Trump said he did, but he didn't. I mean, what do you think? Is there something that you think you can accomplish together?
Yes. First order of business is guardrails. He has promised to politicize the military, to politicize the Department of Justice, to appoint RFK in charge of healthcare in this country. We're going to fight back against any of those attempts because we have to protect the integrity of our institutions and the health of Americans. But there are going to be lanes that we can work together on. I'll give you a few examples. One, I'm the co-chair of the fentanyl working group. We can interdict fentanyl supplies being exported from China to the United States. That's a bipartisan issue. Number two, taking on the drug pricing middlemen known as pharmacy benefit managers. They're bullying pharmacists, they're price gouging patients. That's a bipartisan issue I've done a lot of work on. I think we can get a deal there. On the tax code, they're going to want to cut the corporate tax rate. We're going to disagree on that. But what we might be able to agree on is expanded child tax credits, fixing the R&D tax credit issue from the 2017 bill, and other things that put cash directly in the pockets of average Americans. I think that we could drive compromise there.
All right, I want to read a tweet that you put out on Wednesday having to do with the war in Ukraine and Russians meddling in our election. In responding to a tweet from a Russian government official, you wrote, "Today would be a good day for Biden to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of American weapons in Russia, call in bomb threats to our polling locations. Real bombs come your way." And I want to let you know that people are talking about the bomb threats that were made toward polling locations in Georgia. The FBI said some of them may come from Russian email domains. Let's start with the bomb threats and then Ukraine. What's your reaction to all this, and what should we be doing?
Unacceptable that an adversary would think that they could interfere with our election to that extent and that aggressively. Let's zoom out, though, for a second, because it's a much bigger problem than bomb threats. We have an axis of authoritarianism that knits together China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And they have a very thin ideological alignment, but a very deep commitment to attacking the United States. That's the one thing that binds them together. And if anything crystallizes that, it's the fact that North Korea is invading Europe right now. If that doesn't merit a response, I don't know what does.
North Korea has troops in Russia.
North Korea has troops in Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine.
And to date, Joe Biden has resisted significant bipartisan pressure to authorize Ukraine to use ATACMS and F-16s and other U.S.-made weapons to hit inside of Russia. Russia's hitting inside of Ukraine. Why can't Ukraine hit inside of Russia? Troop staging sites, ballistic missile launching sites, oil refining sites. These are the sinews of Russia's war economy, and unless we can take them out, Russia is going to be able to perpetuate its brutal invasion of Ukraine. Joe Biden has to act decisively and urgently to allow Ukraine to win this war, not simply not lose it.
Looking ahead to 2025, what happens in the Israel-Gaza conflict? Where does that go from here?
There's so many agendas at play in the Middle East that I would not want to prognosticate. What I can say is this. I do not see as big of a shift in U.S. strategy towards Israel as I do potentially with Ukraine and Russia. Regrettably, Donald Trump is pro-Putin, whereas in the Middle East, the degrees of freedom that any U.S. president has is quite limited by Israel's agenda and Iran's agenda. And I don't actually see a significant shift one direction or the other. What I have heard early indications of is that Trump wants to cut off Iranian oil exports to China, and that he intends to greenlight further Israeli strikes against Iran. I'd likely support both of those things.
All right. Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you so much for joining us. Still so much more to talk about, but that's all the time we have for.
Appreciate it.
All right, now, as we look back at how Trump was elected again, you need to look at the swing of Latino voters toward the Republican Party. The NBC News exit poll shows that nationally, Trump had 46% support from Latino voters, compared to just 53% for Vice President Harris. That's a 25-point swing from 2020, when Joe Biden got 65% support from Latino voters.
But it's not just national. Look at these three Eastern Mass communities with the highest Latino population. In each of them, Lawrence, Chelsea, and Lynn, Trump's share of the vote rose from 2020 in Lawrence. It rose 15%.
So what's happening here? Well, to talk about that and so much more are Ozzie Palomo, Republican strategist and managing director at Chartwell Strategy Group, and Luis Jimenez, an associate political science professor at UMass Boston. Thank you both for being here. Before we start, we do want to point out, look, the Latino community is not a monolith. It is made up of varying cultures and beliefs, and though it is sometimes portrayed to be a monolith by the media, it certainly is not. So, Luis, let's start here. Is the swing that we saw in Latino voters just as simple as saying it's the economy?
Well, that certainly had a lot to do with it. But basically what's happening long term, which is going to be a real problem for Democrats, is that the white electorate had already sorted itself out into college-educated people that vote for Democrats and people who don't vote for Republicans. And so what seems to be happening with Latinos is that they're following that pattern as well. That is, working-class people that don't have college degrees are turning to Republicans. And that's, I think, largely what is driving this gap, this change.
Ozzie, obviously, let's be clear, Trump's road back to the White House was built largely in part due to his support among Latino men. Now, as a Republican, what is your view on the shift of Latino voters toward Trump in this election? Or were they always there, they just weren't as active?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they were always there, but obviously the campaign made a concentrated effort to target the Latino community. You saw President Trump do rallies in the South Bronx trying to gin up support in areas of New York City. I'm sure that community is not that different than the three cities you mentioned in Massachusetts. And I think the professor is right. I think what we're seeing here is the kind of the evolution of the Latino community here in the United States. I think there's an assimilation factor going into it. I think the Latino community certainly has begun to assimilate a little bit, perhaps a little bit more than other kind of demographics, but I think the economy is what's critical. If you take a look at Latino populations throughout the country, they're entrepreneurial, they're small business owners. They tend to kind of work with family and keep that kind of close-knit family aspect to it. And I think those are all things that attracted them. I don't think there was one magic issue that drove them all to president, or drove the 45% to President Trump. But I think it was a culmination of a bunch of electoral factors that kind of made that Trump campaign attractive.
What about the cultural factor here, Ozzie? I grew up in Texas, a very large Hispanic and Latino population, and what I always found was they were drawn to the Republican Party because of those conservative values, that the family party. What culturally is there that you see may have driven more of a shift toward the Republican Party?
I think that's part of it, but I mean, we've also seen kind of other demographics throughout the history of the U.S. that the cultural issues tend to change as generations spend more time here in the U.S. We saw that with the Irish migration, and you may have, Irish folks or Irish lineage folks that are younger that maybe don't have the same cultural values as their parents did. And I think inevitably the Latino community will get there as far as having different views on different cultural issues. But again, you mentioned being from Texas. If you take a look at somewhere there, that Latino support for Trump was massive. It was in those border towns. And I think, the crime and safety and immigration factor also played a role in it. But no doubt about it, culturally speaking, there's some kind of underlying issues there that maybe attracted them to Republicans across the board.
Luis, what about you? Is there any cultural shift that may be happening here, or anything that would explain why we are seeing that shift?
Well, part of it is if you look at the literature, the way that people used to vote for Democrats, or the way that the reason they did, is because people sense this something called shared fate. That is the idea that we're all Latinos, we're in this together, and our place is in the Democratic Party because of the civil rights movement and so on. That seems to be basically eroding for the Democrats, and people, Latinos, don't necessarily see themselves, you mentioned at the beginning, as a monolith, right? So you have people that are very different across different groups, and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans might not see the same as Cubans and Mexicans or Mexican Americans, and of course you have generations and so on. But part of it is that there is one strong identity, I think, that is what's changing this, and what that is class. Again, working class people tend to follow their communities, and those communities have already moved to the Republicans. If you're a Latino and you live in rural areas, right, which are very, very red, it's very unlikely that you're going to continue to follow the Democrats just because you're a Latino, right? You're going to follow your friends or the people that you're around. The kinds of messages that you get are all going to be with that Republican frame. So in that sense, they very much are going to follow that identity because they are assimilating to the communities they live in.
The Pew Research Center polled nearly 10,000 registered Latino voters on top of the issues a few months ago, and here's what they found, ranked in order: the economy, health care, violent crime, gun policy, then immigration. Those results the same as they were in 2020. Luis, did the Harris campaign do a poor job addressing those topics, or was the basic mistake just outreach, or is it just the Democrats have not been paying attention to the Latino community the way they should have been?
Well, the Harris campaign did try on the economy. If you look at their ads, a lot of them were about the economy and trying to get people to consider the economic records or Biden, and that she would continue that. She tried. I don't think that's the issue. She spent most of her ads were about the economy. The problem is reaching these voters is not very easy, not just because they're Latino, and that means that some of them prefer things in Spanish, some of them don't. The kinds of things that you reach out to them have to be authentic or have to feel authentic, and that's very, very difficult to do. So that's part of it. But also, I was mentioning is identity-wise and the kinds of information areas in which they're in. It's unlikely that they're going to get these messages that are reinforced by their communities. That is, you might see this on YouTube or you might see this on an ad on something else, but are you going to pay attention to it if the surrounding area that you're in is not going to reinforce that? And the answer seems to be no. You might get the ad, but it's not going to make any difference.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Ozzie, Palomo, Luis Jimenez, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. Up next, new and some would say long overdue benefits to Massachusetts veterans.
Veteran Service Secretary John Santiago joins us to spell out those new benefits, plus how the HERO Act aims to put more veterans in good jobs. Stay.
Welcome back. Monday is Veterans Day, and there will be activities going on around the Commonwealth to honor those who served in our military. Last week in Holyoke, there was a celebration of progress being made at a new Home for Veterans facility that's being built. Builders placed the final beam on the new building, which will replace the soldiers' home where a COVID outbreak in 2020 killed 76 veterans. Veteran Services Secretary John Santiago was in Holyoke for that event, and he joins us here in studio today. John, thank you for being here, and of course, thank you for your service.
It's great to be here.
All right, we obviously don't want to forget and have to remember what happened to those veterans in Holyoke. Can you tell us about what services that facility will bring to veterans who will stay or be treated there?
Well, they are primarily long-term care services. As we know, these are very expensive services, right? And here we have a facility that is doing an amazing job with respect to that. The new building will expand those services, but also expand the number of veterans we can take care of, almost doubling it. And so earlier this week, we had a topping off at this Holyoke facility. It's a $500 million investment, and we're excited about it.
Let's talk also about the HERO Act that was passed by the legislature. It also increases benefits in a number of ways. Talk about the health benefits from that bill as well.
Well, let me just say that thanks to Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, we are engaging with more veterans than we have before. We are investing more in veteran services than we ever have. The HERO Act is the most comprehensive piece of veterans legislation passed in the history of the Commonwealth. It expands benefits, modernizes services, and there's a focus on equity. Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll are committed to serving veterans in a very powerful way. And what Holyoke and Chelsea, where a new home has been put forth, are examples of that. These are two state-of-the-art buildings. They're going to be providing amazing care that are now licensed by the Department of Public Health, that now have administrators that are licensed to do that, and that wasn't the case during the pandemic. So we moved forward. We've completely transformed management, and the outcomes are showing. At Holyoke, there's a 14% decrease in the number of falls there, and so we're looking forward to supporting the folks on the ground, doing the work, and making sure that veterans, that we're honorably serving them because they served us.
So in that bill also, there's a working group that gets created to sort of look at the use of alternative therapies, such as psychedelics, to help veterans who are suffering from mental health disorders. You hear veterans say that this has worked for some of them, but we know last week question 4 failed. It would have allowed clinical use of psychedelics. We know it's a murky legal and political topic, but where do you see that working group maybe having an impact and actually looking at this and saying, yes, let's move forward, no, we shouldn't?
Well, I think we took a common sense approach to this issue. We have the experts here in Massachusetts, we have the hospitals, we have the researchers. Let's look at the data, let's come up with some recommendations, and let's go from there. We know that mental health crisis, particularly within veterans, it's still an issue, right? I get calls almost every day from veterans and their family members asking how can we support their sons and daughters who served our country. As a physician myself who cares for veterans and for non-veterans alike, I mean, we have a mental health crisis across this entire nation. We should be using every tool and out there to support these veterans. And this study group just says, let's look at what's out there. And if there's a path forward, let's look. I would also mention that this isn't just a Democrat or Republican issue. There are states in the South, in the North, the VA, Republicans, Democrats, who are looking for solutions and possibilities to support our veteran community. And this is just one of them. So let's look at it. The
law also increases tax credits that hire low-income disabled veterans. What are you hearing from the businesses? Have they bought into that? Is it working?
Well, the Hillary-Driscoll administration is committed to competitiveness, affordability, and that's working with our private and public partners, right? And so if there are small businesses out there that want to hire veterans because they know that they are reliable, that they work hard, that they have skills, how about we support them? So we implemented this tax credit to do just that.
It's a big bill. Anything, big laws in there, anything that we're not talking about that the public may not be aware of?
Well, a couple of things. We've expanded services in terms of who is eligible for these services. We have amazing benefits in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And whether it's changing the definition to serve more veterans, whether it's a focus on equity to make sure that veterans who may have been underrepresented or didn't get the services that they needed when they entered the military or when they were discharged, that they get these services. So we're excited about it. Really, the work that we're doing in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to turn around a situation that was defined by this Holyoke tragedy. And over the past year and a half, 2 years, we've turned that around. Mission's unaccomplished, but we're on a lot better footing from where we were.
All right, let's talk about this election. We know that that rally at MSG where a comedian called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage was probably hit a little bit personal for you. You're Puerto Rican. You're born in Puerto Rico. Your son was born the day that comment was made. Just take us to that day, to that moment where you saw that and what was going through your mind.
Well, listen, this is supposed to be one of the best, happiest days of my life, and it was. My son was born earlier that morning. Later on that evening, this comedian gets on there and says this, he calls it a joke, but it was quite a hurtful sentiment to the Puerto Rican community, right? And so what does that mean for my son, who I plan to raise in this beautiful country that I love, that I've committed my life to? It was hurtful, right? And I don't want anyone to be living in a country where they feel like they are not appreciated, they are not loved, and they're not supported, right? And so, you know, notwithstanding the politics of this, you know, I'm going to preach to my son and teach him that, listen, like, be a better version of yourself, serve your country, serve your community, and, you know, we're going to keep on launching forward. I think the politics of hate need to be replaced with the politics of love and hope, and that's what I preach at home, that's what I preach in the community.
When he's 10, 15, and you tell him this story about what that comedian said, and then you have to follow it up with, and Trump still won the election. What does that feel like to have to know that that's another part of this story?
Well, it's the history of this country. We've had our ups and downs for the 250 years that we've been here, right? I look at this period in American history as a very pivotal one. But all we can really do is move forward, right? Fight for what we believe in. And that's what I'm committed to doing as Secretary of Veteran Services. We still have men and women serving our country abroad. They're coming home with PTSD, depression, looking for jobs and educational opportunities. We have a lot of work to do here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I'm just glad that people like Governor Healy, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, and folks that I'm working with in state government are committed to that.
John Santiago, thank you to you, and thank you to your family for your service, and thanks for joining us here in the studio.
Thanks, guys.
That's it for this edition of At Issue. Join us next Sunday when we're joined by Segun Idowu, Chief of Economic Opportunity and Inclusion for the City of Boston. For At Issue, I'm Corey Smith.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Have a great day.